He first noticed it while reading aloud late one evening, not for any particular reason but simply to hear his own voice in the room, to break the growing tension that had begun settling across the corners of his apartment like a dust he could never quite wipe away. The book was old, pages soft and yellowed, the kind of novel no one writes anymore, dry, contemplative, filled with long, curling thoughts that matched the quiet hum of the night. He read slowly, carefully, his voice barely rising above a murmur, and it wasn't until he paused for water that he realized something was wrong. The last line he had spoken, something about a hallway stretching endlessly, echoed back to him just as he set the glass down, but it arrived too late, not by much, just a heartbeat beyond what should have been natural, and in a slightly different tone, not quite off in pitch, but lacking something subtle, something personal, as if the voice returning to him had forgotten it had once belonged to him. He blinked, stared at the far wall, tried to convince himself it was the acoustics, or the angle, or the quiet trickery of fatigue. But from that moment on, every time he spoke aloud in the apartment, he found himself listening not to his own voice, but to the echo that followed, watching it for discrepancies like one watches a shadow for sudden disobedience. At first, it was barely noticeable, a syllable missed, a pause where there shouldn't be, an emphasis he didn't recall using, but with each day, the delay grew more pronounced, and the echo less faithful. He tested it. He repeated the same phrase over and over, something simple, something without emotion. "I'm still here," he would say, standing in the center of the room, and each time the words returned, they did so just slightly wrong. Not incorrect. Not distorted. Just adjusted. As though whatever force reflected his voice had begun to learn from it, to edit it, to take ownership of the rhythm without understanding its meaning. The apartment wasn't large, a single bedroom, a narrow hall, a kitchen that always smelled faintly of copper, and it had never felt threatening before. But now it held a new kind of weight, a pressure that didn't come from the walls themselves but from the space between the sounds, from the growing awareness that something inside the apartment was paying attention not to his movements, not to his presence, but to the way his voice filled the air. He stopped speaking for a while, afraid of what might come back. But silence proved worse. Because in the absence of his voice, the rooms began to feel empty in a way they never had before, not uninhabited, but unfinished, as if they waited for him to say something, anything, to keep the rhythm intact. And when he finally did, late one night after hours of holding still, the echo returned not with his last word, but with a different phrase altogether, only one word off, just one substitution, and it was enough to make him step back, mouth dry, heart thudding. He had said, "Nothing's changed." What came back was, "Nothing will change." The voice was still his. But it wasn't. That night, as he lay in bed, the silence stretched like fabric pulled too tight, and he began to wonder whether echoes could lie, whether reflections of sound could drift away from their source, evolve in the stillness, take on new intent without ever making a sound of their own. Because what he was hearing now wasn't just a repetition. It was a response. In the days that followed, he found himself unable to stop speaking, not out of comfort or habit, but because the silence between his words had grown too thick to endure, because something about the apartment, or what it had become, now demanded input, now required a constant supply of sound to maintain its shape, and though he no longer trusted the echoes that returned to him, he feared more what might happen if no echoes returned at all. He began to mutter to himself while making coffee, reading signs aloud in the street as if the act of articulation might follow him home and tether him to something real, filling the quiet with nonsense phrases just to see which ones came back unchanged and which ones didn't, marking a mental catalogue of responses that no longer felt like repetition but like the early stages of conversation conducted in a language that only pretended to be his own. The strange part wasn't just that the echoes had drifted away from accuracy, but that they had developed an unsettling consistency, a kind of logic that only made sense across time, a tone, a cadence, a rhythm that grew more assertive with each passing night, as if the space had been learning from him, or perhaps learning how to be him, and now no longer needed to wait for a phrase to mimic. At times, he would speak a sentence and hear nothing in return, only to find, minutes later, in a different room, a faint murmur in the wall behind him, a delayed recitation of something he had already forgotten he said, delivered back to him in a voice that matched his timbre but missed the weight of meaning, like a shadow practicing how to walk with conviction.